Hello and welcome to episode 355 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert. As always, Damien Fay, he's back, and me, Andy Leakes. How are you doing, Damien? Welcome back. You're looking good, considering.
Considering, because after I did I think it was midweek markets the other day, my wife turned around and said to me, "You look awful on that video," which is it's your nearest and dearest who will tell you the truth. And Andy actually contacted me after that episode and said, "Blimey, Damien, I'm having to edit out your heavy breaths and breathing." And I had to have a lie down. I just told Andy off podcast that because of the COVID, I didn't realise I'm right at the end of my isolation period, but it obviously taken a little bit more out of me. So if I'm sounding a bit breathy today or cough occasionally, then do forgive me, because I've got a lot to talk about on today's show. But yeah, I find it a little bit more difficult than normal. And another slight admission is I think she's gone to sleep. But in the background of the podcast today, my cat, Bella. So anyone who knows me, follows us on social media, knows that my best buddy is my cat called Bella. I think she's 17 or 18. She was a stray we took in years ago. I hate to say it, I think she's on her way out, I think, in the next year. She's got stage 3 kidney disease. Anyway, she follows me around a lot when I'm at home, and I'm at home at the moment doing the podcast, and she's sitting on the bed next to me sleeping, and she's been purring rather loudly. So if you hear a purr, then it's Bella in the background. I'm not going to boot her out. I feel for her. So with those caveats and excuses out the way, then I suppose we probably best get on with the show, haven't we?
Yeah, let me know what's coming up. And by the way, Bella being in the background, do not worry about that. I'm not even going to try and edit her out. Let's keep a legacy of Bella in the podcast. We can listen back in years to come. So what have we got coming up on the pod this week?
So this week on the podcast is the title. We always decide the title of the podcast after we've done the show. And this title probably will have something like the difference between the rich and the poor. And it's a slightly provocative title. I don't like the definitions of rich and poor, but it is something that's been inspired by a lot that's been going on in the press of late. And what I want to do is talk about something that Jack Monroe started last week. Now, Harvey, on last week's podcast, I listened to the podcast, you guys did a great show, mentioned about Jack Monroe, who is a campaigner against poverty and inequality. She's done a number of cookbooks for people who are, well, she was herself having to survive by using food banks. So her cookbooks are incredibly cheap meals. And she is an inspiration. If you haven't followed her on Twitter, for example, make sure you do. And what Jack did was shine a light on the fact that people on low incomes actually have or experience a different rate of inflation to that which is the official numbers that are put out there because of the way the inflation numbers are collated. And I'm going to go through the actual tweet that she wrote because I don't know how many millions of people have seen this tweet now. It's like a thread, but I'll go through it in her own words. And she highlights the inequality that's out there in terms of the inflation that people experience. Now, in this podcast, I'm going to take it a stage further and talk about the inequality that exists out there between people on low incomes and people who are wealthy. But then on top of that, I'm going to do an end part where I'm going to look at the idea of wealthy people versus those on low income and some common denominators that happen to occur with people who are wealthy, because effectively the game is rigged. So the game that we play of life and money is rigged in favour of people who are wealthy. And it's this idea of trying to highlight that, talk about it. It's uncomfortable for people who are out there. If you find it uncomfortable, then great, because we need to be talking about this. But I'm going to be talking about a book as well in that, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now, it's a very famous money book that was written about 20 years ago. And it was written by a guy called Robert Kiyosaki, and he talks about the difference between rich and poor people. And I don't agree with everything that's in that book, but it is a very famous book, and there are some important lessons or things you can take away from it. So let me jump back before we get onto the lessons that people can learn about wealthy people and how they win this game that's rigged against people on low income. And I want to start with what Jack wrote, and then I'm going to show you how this game is really rigged against people on low incomes. So I'm going to start with a thread that Jack wrote on Twitter. And in her own words, it says, "I woke up this morning to the radio talking about the cost of living rising by a further 5%. It infuriates me that the index they use for this calculation, which grossly underestimates the real cost of inflation as it happens to people with the least. Allow me to briefly explain. This time last year, the cheapest pasta in my local supermarket, one of the big four, was 29p for 500 grams. Today it's 70p. That's a 141% price increase as it hits the poorest and most vulnerable households. This time last year, the cheapest rice at the same supermarket was 45p for a kilogram bag. Today, it's £1 for 500 grams. That's a 344% price increase as it hits the poorest and most vulnerable households. Baked beans were 22p, now 32p, a 45% increase year on year. Canned spaghetti was 13p, now 35p, a price increase of 169%. Bread was 45p, now 58p, a price increase of 29%. And she goes on and lists more and more examples and then writes that these are just the ones that I know off the top of my head. There will be many more examples. When I started writing my recipe blog 10 years ago, I could feed myself and my son on £10 a week. The system by which we measure the impact of inflation is fundamentally flawed. It completely ignores reality and the real price rises for people on minimum wages, 0-hour contracts, food-backed clients, and millions more. But I guess when the vast majority of our media were privately educated and came from the same handful of elite universities, nobody thinks to actually check in with anyone out there in the world to see how we're doing. And she says, obviously terribly, thanks for asking. I dropped the F-bomb that she dropped in that. You should read the thread in full because she goes on to illustrate the fact that some of the high-end meal deals that are in supermarkets, the prices of those haven't changed. She also illustrates about the number of value brands have dropped over time in supermarkets as well, which means that people have less choice. The point is that people who are on lower incomes are disproportionately impacted by these price rises, whereas people who are wealthy aren't exposed to the same increase. And it is in the government's interest to basically hide that fact and perpetuate a lie that inflation is only at 5%. And to compound things, actually, which I'm sure Jack points this out somewhere, but when you think about benefits for low-income people, they are often increased in line with the official rate of inflation. And that will be based on this broader index of goods and services, a lot of which people on lower incomes do not buy. And so the increases on the smaller items, which are diluted down, aren't impacted. So going back to what Jack wrote, in my view, then we should be also looking at this new index or some form of index, which Jack is obviously championing, that will help to increase benefits for people on lower incomes at a much faster rate than what the official rate of inflation is, because their income isn't going up, keeping anywhere near in line with the increase in cost they're paying. Now, obviously, some people will sit there and think, well, they're only 50p increases, but that matters if you are truly on that breadline, because every penny counts. And Jack points this out brilliantly. If you go and look at some of the media pieces she's done over the last week, she will illustrate that fact that if you can't understand the fact that a 50%, 100%, couple 100% increase on something that might only cost about 30p will push some people beyond being able to afford that item, then you probably need to have a real hard look at yourself. Now, what I want to talk about now is that this game is rigged way further than just about price rises that we see in shops. So if you are a low income, and I'm going to use the word low income throughout the podcast, I'm not going to use the words poor. I don't like stereotyping people into a group, the poor people. People who are on lower incomes and people who are obviously wealthy or rich are going to be on much higher incomes. I'm not going to define the exact bands. You know what lower income will be. It'll be people who probably are earning somewhere near that personal tax allowance level or less, but basically they're struggling to meet their costs. Now what Jack did was got me thinking about the power of the conversation and talking about money. And so this is what's driving this podcast, because what Jack did is highlight this injustice and this inequality, and it sparked a wave, millions of people who are suffering based on this, to then make this go viral because they finally had somebody who had some influence who was highlighting this. And then you will see there's a massive rally around of it became the biggest story pretty much online. If you ignore the Partygate stuff that's going on in Westminster, it is the thing that the government, everybody's talking about. We even had all the media outlets doing interviews. We had the Office of National Statistics rush to try and, in my view, probably shut the door after the horse has bolted. They've said that they are making changes to the future index. But what was great, I'm not going to read out the passage, but Jack started to create this Boot Vimes index, basically an index that was based on a passage that was spoken by a character in a Terry Pratchett novel. If you've never read Terry Pratchett, they're well worth reading. And a nice circular reference, actually, I remember the other day, Terry Pratchett gave me or presented me with my degree when I was in my younger days, which was quite a moment. But Terry Pratchett's character basically made an observation that poor people spend a lot more money on things than rich people. So he talked about the boots that he wore, and that people who are poor end up buying cheap boots for, like, let's say, I can't remember what the currency is in the book, but say £20, whilst rich people pay 50 for better boots. The cheaper ones don't last as long, so they end up having to buy more of these boots over time, whereas the rich person has the nicer boots that last much longer. And so over the course of years, poor people spend a lot more on boots than rich people, and that is the difference between rich and poor. The poor end up having to spend more money. And that is what's inspired this index she's going to create, which looks at prices of products to actually show what the real rate of inflation experienced by people on lower income. Now, there is many ways in which this game and the world is rigged against people on lower income. It isn't true that people on lower income end up making bad choices and that's why they don't succeed. I don't buy that for a second. So I want to show you that, for example, let's look at credit. Okay, so if you're on lower income, but just on the fact that you're on a lower income, are probably going to get a worse rate of interest on your credit card. You are going to be more than likely charged more for the same amount of credit as somebody who is on a higher income. There are cards that are possible that might get you a decent rate of interest, but as a general rule, if you go and look around and do the research, the amount of interest you will pay on credit will generally be higher on those cards. And also, because you've got lower income, you're not going to be necessarily be given a higher credit limit. But of course, that game, because you're on a lower income, you are being charged more for that same essential product. So lower income people get worse financial products than people on higher incomes. And that partly is because people on lower income do subsidize people who are higher earners. And that is because the wealthy end up providing more of the profit for these banks and institutions. They want those customers because if in terms of actual pounds and pence, the amount they'll earn off these people over the long term, the richer people, they want to create attractive products. And one way of doing that is charging people who are on lower incomes relatively more. It's not only that though, you've got to think that people who might be on lower income, it could be due to circumstance, something could have happened, or the job that they happen to be doing, which could be a vocation that could be paying a lower income. Okay, so people don't just go through life and think, I don't want to earn any more money. They might have a reason why they end up earning that income. Okay, you can't judge people for the reason that they earn money. Things happen in people's lives as well, that they might lose their job, there might be some sort of crisis or whatever, and they find themselves not having as much money coming in through the door. When you're faced with a choice and you've got to put a fire out, you don't question where the water comes from. Okay, you don't sit there and think, oh, where'd the water come from? The answer is to put the fire out. So when you're in a world where payday lenders, for example, were able to offer you credit at such a rate of speed because of the design of them, when you used to go on there and they'd have those slidey bars and the money would be hitting your account in no time at all, they are inferior products that hurt people's credit reports. So people took out those products, and the people more likely to were people who were struggling on low incomes, but they were an inferior product, which actually meant that it hurt their credit report. So if you have payday loans on your credit file, you will find it more difficult to get a mortgage, for example, or other types of borrowing. That ends up getting into a vicious circle where you end up therefore being refused credit in the future, or because when you apply for credit, the rate that is advertised is not necessarily the rate that you will get. And the rate that you will get will depend on your personal circumstances. And because of your circumstances, you can end up therefore starting into a cycle where you're only getting credit that is more and more expensive. And if the credit becomes more and more expensive and you struggle to pay that, we get in this vicious cycle again where you can then end up defaulting and you end up getting debts that pile up. That is the world in which lower income people find themselves in. That is not their fault. That is by design. So when I said about putting the fire out, you don't question where the water comes from. And also they have limited choice. This is a thing that's different between people who have low incomes and people who have wealthy, is the choice of products that you have, not just financial, but in other areas. Now, I'm going to move on to energy. Okay, so we talk about energy and there is an energy crisis. So all of us see that we're paying more and more on our energy bills. The problem is that for people with lower income, the amount of money that they're paying on energy and the proportion it makes of their earnings is getting higher and higher, far quicker than it is for somebody who's wealthy. So if your bill, which is likely to happen in the next couple of months, by April, you're going to see your annual bill for your energy jump by probably £600. And that's even with the price cap, because that's the price cap that's being adjusted. From what I'm hearing, it's going to probably go up by £600 to £700. If you're on low income, you are going to have to find that £600 to £700 from somewhere, because you are literally budgeting to the point that you can't afford to be able to pay for any extras. That's where we get to this point where people have to make a decision whether they feed their kids or they actually pay their bills. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is that the game is rigged again, because people who are on low incomes are much more likely to live in places where the cost of energy is going to be higher. Now, the reason they are is because they might be on a prepayment meter. So prepayment meters are where you have to obviously top it up and you get like a card or key, you put money on and they can then use that money and pay for their energy. So if you've never seen this, and there'll be plenty of people who listen to this podcast who have either never experienced it or never seen it, people will walk into a newsagent and they will say, can you put £10 on the meter? And they give over the key stroke card. The shop puts the money on the meter, they then go home and therefore they can have their electricity on. That is how people on low income will live. And part of the prepayment will be down to the fact they probably live in rented accommodation because they can't afford to buy a house. And therefore the meter is there as a result of being a rental property. The landlord isn't going to change that. Now, as a low income person who is more likely to be in that position, there is an energy cap on that as well, but those tariffs are generally more expensive than ones where you might pay it ongoing because there's an element of credit in that. They are more expensive. The thing is, you can shop around. Yeah, that is an argument. But the choice of tariffs is very small. So the amount you can save, again, is not the same as everybody else. So again, the game is rigged because you're lower income and you're in this scenario, you have less choice than everybody else. And the fact that you live in a house that probably is one that isn't going to be a well-insulated house with a really efficient boiler, you're going to be paying more for energy to keep the house warm because you're going to have to use more to be able to keep it warm because it's an inefficient property. And that is going to be because of where you can afford to live and the sort of landlord you're going to have and the circumstances you find yourself. Now, I was looking at a report and they analysed the usage of energy based upon different income levels. And it varies quite interestingly throughout the various different income levels. So you get really wealthy people who might use a lot of energy because they have like big houses or whatever. But there is a point where there are people on low incomes who can end up using a disproportionate amount of a particular energy, say gas or electricity. And particularly electricity occurs because they only have access to those types of appliances where they live. So they've got like electric heaters in their rooms. They don't have wide central heating throughout the house, which can end up costing them a fortune to be able to use, to be able to heat. So they're not even at a point like everybody else where they are able to cut the cost of their energy bills. So the game is rigged already. So you can see what I'm trying to get people to picture is like a game of snakes and ladders where the aim is to get to the top, but the game is rigged. The dice are loaded in favour of people who are wealthier. The game gets easier the wealthier you are. And also, which I'm going to come on to later, the wealthier people know where the snakes and know where the ladders are. And it's something I'm going to explain in a bit more detail. Now, that is already 2 ways I've explained how the system is working against people on low income. And so anybody who thinks that people on low income have a choice to be able to make that they can try and change and become wealthy, it is very difficult because they're swimming against the tide. Now, insurance, okay, so if people think about insurance, now car insurance is compulsory. You have to have it as a legal requirement. So that isn't even optional for people who are on low incomes. The problem is that insurance is priced in a way that is, again, penalises people on low incomes because people on low incomes will live in postcodes because your postcode impacts your insurance that are more expensive to insure. So people on low incomes can end up, despite the fact that they might not personally be any more risk, paying more for a product because of the postcode that they live in. And that will be the same as for home insurance. But the other issue that you've got is that insurances work in a way where the biggest savings go to the people who can afford to pay annually. So if you can't afford to pay bills annually, which people on low incomes can't, you pay monthly. and therefore you pay more than the person who can afford to pay annually. And it goes back to this idea that buying things in bulk that reduces costs is not something that is readily available to people who are no income, whether it's food, but whether it's things like insurance as well, or financial products. So again, the game is rigged against people who are on low incomes. They're already fighting. They're paying more essentially for the same product as somebody who is wealthier. And again, this is something that we're not talking about because it's an inconvenient truth. And one of the things, the reason why it isn't talked about enough, because the people who benefit from the pricing structure are the people who are therefore wealthier. And the people who are wealthier also tend to be the people who are probably in positions within companies that are making these decisions anyway, and also people who are in positions of power. So we're already in a world where things are difficult for people with no income. But unfortunately, the situation could be about to get worse, because as we have more touch points with technology and there's much more information about you and I available to companies like insurance companies, whether it's via social media or whatever means that they're able to acquire that via technology, individual pricing becomes more and more prevalent, or could become more and more prevalent. So rather than have risk pooling where they end up looking at risk as a collective and therefore assign cost based upon the wider population or sections of it, they could drill down and therefore start to charge people based upon individual circumstances, which can mean for people on no income, therefore penalise them even more for the circumstances that they can find themselves in. And people who are wealthier can end up paying less. And again, it's this subsidy that occurs that isn't open and isn't out there that makes this game rigged. It is the inequality that goes beyond just this idea of people are paying even more than for food. Now, obviously people who are on low incomes pay a greater percentage of their income on essential non-discretionary items. And it goes back to that thing I said, that kind of buy cheap, buy twice. They have to buy inferior products. And that includes food, for example, but other products as well. And they end up paying more. Now, one of the things we keep moving on, mortgages, okay? So most people on no incomes might not be able to even get a mortgage, so they're renting. And rents keep going up, and that's at the whim, obviously, of their landlord. And so they don't have a choice of whether they want to fix their rent. They don't. You can't go to your landlord and say, I want to fix my rent for the next 2 years, unless they're obviously a very good landlord. But people who have mortgages do have a choice whether they want to try and fix their outgoings, and they have that by being able to remortgage. Now, if we ignored credit issues for 1 second, then low income people can obviously get smaller mortgages. Let's say they could get a mortgage. Then the size of their salary dictates they can only get a certain size of mortgage. And okay, you might look at that and go, well, that's sensible because I've got to be able to repay it. But the largest multiples on mortgages are reserved for the wealthiest, generally speaking, and also for the people with the best jobs. And that's because you get things like professional mortgages. So people like doctors, for example, people who have jobs that are deemed as very secure because there's a high level of education or high level of studying that requires them to have done to be able to get that job. They're deemed as being a very low risk in terms of losing their jobs. The mortgage companies will lend them more. But others will give you high multiples if you earn over £100,000, for example. So people on higher incomes, so high earners, have access to credit. But when we're talking about credit, we're talking about the difference we've done podcasts on between bad debt and good debt. Wealthier people have more access to good debt. It's a fact. Because as I talked about before, they're more likely to have good debt as well. So we're already getting to the world again where people who are wealthy are able to accelerate that. And again, this is something I'm going to come on to a little bit later. Now, this is an interesting one. Okay. So a lot of those things I talked about were related to financial products. So low income households have inferior products. They do. And the issue you've also got is one of the biggest bills for a lot of people. It eventually comes down to tax. So if you think about the wage that people earn, the amount of tax that they pay is a significant chunk of it. And the taxation system works in such a way that it can hamper or work against people who are low incomes. And for people on higher incomes, taxation becomes optional. Now, by that I mean they are able to mitigate it. And it's one of the biggest difference that people who are on lower incomes, because of the jobs that they will be doing and the amount that they earn and the opportunities open to them, they will end up being taxed and will unlikely to be able to avoid it. So they end up paying a significant portion of their wealth in tax. And in fact, incredibly wealthy people, we've seen this all around the world. If you looked at, do you remember with the election, we had Donald Trump didn't want to disclose his tax returns. Incredibly wealthy people can end up paying hardly any tax at all. Now, if we look at taxation, okay, there's a 1.25% increase that's going to occur on national insurance contributions that's going to happen supposedly in April 2022. And there's debate whether that's going to change or not, but as it stands, it's meant to be happening. Now, that increase means that contributions of national insurance for people who are on, say, 20 grand is just shy of 7%. That's what that will roughly equate to. Okay, so that total national insurance contribution they're going to pay after April. As you move up the income levels, you get to about £50,000. It's nearly 11%. It works out to. But as you start to earn more and more money, because of the way national insurance is applied, if you earn above £50,270, the rate of national insurance drops from 12% to 2%. The more you earn, the amount of national insurance you pay as a percentage of your income starts to fall to the point where you'll end up having it as a percentage of your income. It could, in fact, start falling back down to 7% once you start earning over £100,000. My point is that tax rises can disproportionately hurt people on lower incomes. And if you're talking about the pounds and pence, if they're already struggling, then adding £130 on their annual bill, national insurance bill that is going to make a material impact. Adding about £1,000 on somebody who earns £100,000 isn't going to make a huge amount of difference, because also there are other ways which they will probably mitigate it in terms of taxation. Now, again, lower income households bear the brunt of indirect taxation more than higher income households. And now that's not my view. If you go and look in December 2021, so that was a couple of months ago, there was a parliamentary briefing that stated that very fact. And when you go back, it's been like this way for years. Going back as far as 2013, there was a report published by the Institute of Economic Affairs that worked out even then that the poorest fifth of households spend a third of their disposable income on indirect taxes, whereas the richest fifth spend half of that. So basically, lower income households back then were spending twice as much money on indirect taxes as wealthy people. So the briefing that I mentioned, the parliamentary briefing, mentioned that if you wanted to try and reduce income inequality, then direct taxation needed to increase because it hurts wealthier people more. But council tax, the way it currently works, actually undermines that. And that's obviously because of the way it's banded. And the idea that some people will be sitting and listening to this podcast will go, well, okay, so why do they have to? VAT, yeah, it's a value-added tax. You pay it on goods and services. You don't technically have to buy them. Well, yeah, that's the theory, but you know in reality that's not how it works. Because you may sit there and think, if you look at the VAT that's charged, the reason why lower incomes may end up paying more tax, because they might spend more on things like cigarettes, for example. And they may also pay alcohol duty. In fact, it was when you look at the analysis from back in 2013, they said that obviously lower income households actually spent more on cigarette products. And so that's where some of the indirect taxation was coming from. But my point is that some people go, well, they shouldn't buy those things. Well, no, you're thinking about it in a slightly wrong way. What we should be saying is the government shouldn't tax the things that people on lower income disproportionately buy. So the government has a choice of where it puts VAT and what it applies it on. And so therefore the government chooses to put VAT on things like alcohol duty and duty on cigarettes. They choose to put those on products. And so therefore their choice is to put them on those products which lower income people are buying. They could not if they wanted to. And to show you that this is almost ridiculous, in October last year, we had a budget. But in the budget, we had the Chancellor decide to look at alcohol duty and change it and try to create a bit more of the strength of the drink dictated the taxation of it. So the stronger the drink that people would buy, the more there would be taxation on it. But of course, when you looked at that, what it really meant, if you were being a little bit flippant, that put it this way, you got taxed more if you weren't drinking champagne. And if you look at what do wealthy people more likely drink, are they sitting there popping bottles of high strength cider or anything like that? What they're more likely drinking is champagne. So people were drawing the conclusion that the government was actually choosing to almost lighten the tax on things that wealthy people buy. So the choices of taxation are there. And I mean, one of the things I looked at the taxation of certain products. If you go back to 2020 to 2021, and there was £793 billion worth of public sector tax receipts. Now, if you look at the top five, income tax is 196 billion, then it's national insurance at 144 billion, VAT at 117 billion, corporation tax at 54 billion, council tax at 38 billion, capital taxes at 30 billion, then tobacco and alcohol duties at 22 billion, fuel duty at 21 billion, business rates at 17 billion, and then there's other things that come in there. The government could choose to change that makeup, if that makes sense. So they are generating almost as much on things like alcohol and tobacco as they are on things like capital taxes and basically council tax, taxations that are on people's wealth. So that is a choice. So the system, if you ask me, is rigged in a way that the taxation on lower income households isn't applied as fairly as it could be. Now, tax band creep is another concept that starts to hit people on lower incomes. Now, everybody gets hurt by tax band creep. It's where they don't increase tax bands, so inflation starts to hopefully increase your wages over time because you'll go and hopefully get a pay rise. And then what happens is your wages go up, but the tax bands don't. So more of your income falls into higher tax bands and you get taxed more. Again, that will start to hit lower income because they'll go from a 0% tax band to potentially a 20% tax band. And the other things I'm going to throw out there, because I don't want to dwell on it because I'm conscious of the length of this podcast could get to, but why is the taxation on income always been far higher than the taxation on things like capital gains? That has historically been the case, and you can mitigate many of the things when it comes to taxation on capital gains. And don't forget that gains are only taxed once they're crystallized. So you can become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, but you never pay tax on it until the point at which you crystallize that gain. And the other thing is that people who are higher earners will tend to have assets that will grow in value that they're not taxed upon, but they are also likely to have access to things like entrepreneurs relief. They will start to use things like business property relief. They might be using gift relief in terms of inheritance tax. These reliefs I've mentioned basically lower their taxation. They keep more of their wealth because they can pass on more to next generations, which people on lower income can't, which compounds the problem. They also aren't charged on their wealth, which actually starts to accrue over time. So they get wealthier and wealthier without tax being applied to it. They also can pay lower rates of tax when they start to sell some products, which may be a business or not. So that's the entrepreneurs relief. And of course, people who own their own homes, which is a lot of people in this country, there isn't taxation on owning your own property, your principal property. There's a relief on that. Well, if a lower income household doesn't own their own house, they never benefit from downsizing or anything like that. So the game isn't even for everybody. So moving on from taxation, then we move on to things like banking. And banking is an interesting one because if you remember, there was unauthorized and authorized overdrafts. There was a movement caused by the regulator where banks essentially standardized the charges across both types of overdraft. The net result was the charges on overdrafts pretty much went up to about 40%. And people on lower incomes will disproportionately be using overdrafts. And those charges on overdrafts are essentially what pay for free banking for the rest of the world. And so again, lower income people are paying for or paying charges which wealthier people don't because they are wealthier, but they also get free banking as a result of that. So again, these are all things that if you look at it, the game isn't really fair. And so to sit there and look at people on lower income, it does go beyond this whole idea that they just pay for more for products in the supermarket. The game is rigged against them. And the reason why this is important is because things change and there's a lot of luck in life that people who are wealthy won't ever admit to. And you could find yourself very quickly through a period of bad health and accident, suddenly finding that you enter the lower income world, even if you've never inhabited it before. And then once you're in a period of being in low income, then all of those things that I spoke about in this podcast so far start to work against you. And then it becomes more difficult to try and get out of the lower income bracket. And I mean, even if you said to people, I might say, well, people should go and get a better job. Well, okay, that's not always easy. But even if you did, imagine if you tried to commute. If you have very low income, it costs more to buy train tickets daily or pay for things singular. If you can't buy an annual pass for your train or a monthly or weekly, then that means people with no income, because they're budgeting over such short time frames, are even paying more for things like going to work. So that is the part of the podcast where I want people to suddenly realise that, yeah, there is this inequality and the game isn't necessarily fair on everybody. And this snakes and ladders game is being played by different sets of people, some with loaded dice, but also some that know where the snakes are and where the ladders are. And I can explain it a little bit more, because the book that I'm going to talk about, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, it was a very famous book. And the basic premise of the book was this guy, when he was young, he had his dad, who was very educated, I think he was a teacher, and he worked a steady job and didn't earn lots of money, worked hard, paid his bills, but wasn't wealthy. Whereas his friend, whose dad was wealthy, and he didn't even actually quite realise, was very good with money. And the Rich Dad, Poor Dad idea is that he tells, or the author tells, the story of how the rich dad, his friend's dad, taught him and his friend how to be rich, because he was rich. And he contrasts that with the lessons that he learned from his poor dad, i.e. his own dad, because they had two very different mindsets about how to work with money. One, he claims, understood money, and one didn't. And the couple of bullet points I want to pull out from the whole book give people interesting thoughts. And I don't agree with everything that's in the book, actually, because there's quite a bit of generalization in it. And the author admits that, because it was only his own experiences. But he says the poor and the middle class, which I don't like that term, but they work for money and the rich have money work for them. And the next thing he points out is that rich people, or wealthy people, prioritize assets over income. And that means that they will try and get assets that create income, so therefore they can ultimately become financially independent. And deriving wealth from income is a flaw. Wealthy people won't do that, because income is highly taxed. Now, you'll see there's an echo from some of the things I was just mentioning earlier on, that even in the UK, that it holds up, because taxation on assets is generally lower than taxation on income. When you earn money, you are taxed at source via PAYE if you're employed, and it's very difficult to mitigate that. But income is taxed heavily, whereas tax on assets doesn't have to be. And his other lessons are that wealthy people understand the concept. It's about how much money you keep. So when you've got money, you've made money, it's about how much you keep as well. So how much of that money that you've made that you don't let go of elsewhere. They also understand the difference between good debt and bad debt. We've done a whole podcast on that. And they also basically don't pay tax. Now, I'm massively generalizing what this book says, and go and read the book for yourself. I think there are some generalizations in there that some people won't particularly like, but there are some general lessons that do hold up. And from my experience with rich clients, there are some points that are true, but there are also some that aren't. People on lower incomes will tend to focus on liabilities, acquiring liabilities that they think are assets. So, for example, they will buy things that effectively they have to finance because they think it is something that is valuable. So it could even be they go and buy a bigger and bigger and bigger house to live in. And his point is that that actually creates a larger and larger liability that you've got to try and fund, that stops you ever becoming financially independent. That's very different from investing, and maybe even investing in things like buy-to-let. And the other thing that he points out, which are things that I do agree with people I've met, they have a laser focus and they know who's on their team. And this phrase relates to the ability to employ or pay people to do things to minimize the amount of taxation that you pay. Now, what I want people to take from that is, if they want to go and read the book, then do so and let me know what you think of it. But taking some of the points that he raises, ignoring the sort of stereotyping that goes on, you can see how it mirrors some of the inequalities that I've mentioned earlier on. Well, if wealthy people become wealthier and wealthier, and it's happened during the pandemic because of things like QE, because of government incentives or things that they have implemented. And taxation is optional for people who are wealthy because they employ financial advisors and highly paid accountants who will mitigate their taxation. Now, I know this because I used to work in the city, and I worked for a firm who would give financial advice to very wealthy lawyers. I've mentioned it before, who were earning £1.5 million a year. And a lot of what we did was solving the taxation problem. I can tell you now, of a time where a client walked in during his lunch hour, wandered in the office, spoke to me, said, "Oh, hi, Damien. Yeah, I've just come with the check for my pension contribution." Back in those days, the pension contributions you could make were larger. He wrote the check out for £250,000 and then talked about how Tottenham had been getting on, and then off he went. And the reason he was doing it was because he knew the amount of tax relief he was getting on that pension contribution, and he was mitigating his tax liability, how much tax he has to pay, because he wanted to keep more of that for himself. He also put money into his children's pensions and one for his wife. All of these things that people who are wealthy do. The rules of taxation, as I mentioned, like capital gains tax, different types of investments that exist. So enterprise investment schemes, VCTs, which are venture capital trusts, they are products which give huge tax release on the way in, like 30% tax release on the way in. And some of them you don't even get taxed on the income the dividends make. And so wealthy people have access to these tax. They're not loopholes, they are products, and they are high risk products, but because they are wealthy, they can take more risk than somebody who isn't, because they can afford to lose that money, or they can wait out the ups and downs of the market, but they end up getting huge amounts of tax relief. These sort of levers aren't available to people on lower incomes. And so really what the lesson from the first part of the podcast is the game is rigged against people on lower incomes. And we need to all talk about it so we can try and change that game and try and change the fact that wealthier people have a distinct advantage. But as the game is now, then you have to learn how to play it better than what you are. You've got to try, if you can, to get to the point where you are buying assets that generate income, because wealthier people use that to their advantage. And it's not easy, because all of the things that rich dad, poor dad, and the things that I saw with people who are wealthy, all of the things that I mentioned, which are true, are very difficult to achieve when you're on a low income. But that is the direction of travel, which is why Money to the Masses was set up, because one of the ways to be able to try and go in that direction is through education. And so be able to understand the power of putting money in ISAs or the power of compounding. All of these things that we talk about, you might not be able to achieve it in your lifetime, but you could achieve it for your next of kin, like your the next generation, the generation of that, by putting wheels in motion, because a lot of wealthy people also inherited their wealth. And the study that I also looked at, which tries to look at how to stop the inequality, the income inequalities that exist, one of the issues is about inheritance, that people on low incomes don't tend to inherit anything. And so that, again, is one of those things that we need to try and break. And as individuals, we're going to have to try to. It's not easy, but for people who already maybe aren't on low incomes and they're further up that chain, then they need to realize that actually, if I want to be more successful at this game, then these are the things I need to try to do. And I just want to kind of finish on a bit of a metaphor. Right? So to illustrate the point of how this works. So if you imagine there were two people, there's somebody who was on a lower income, and the way you got paid was you went and sat in a room and you sat down at the table. So you got someone with lower income and you got someone with a higher income. And if you imagine the way the world worked is that you got your salary put on the table in front of you, and then people came along and took chunks of it away and delivered what you wanted, whether that's food, whether that's energy, whether that's paying your credit card bills. Now, what would happen in that room would be a very interesting dynamic, which you don't see. So let's say, for example, the low income person, he might sit down and his gross wage is put in front of him. The taxman would come along and say, right, I just need to take this pile of money here. And the person on low income go, what's that then? That's national insurance. Okay, so that's for my future, is it? Well, technically not. It just goes into the general pot. But yeah, hopefully you might get a state pension when you're older. And just as they think, well, okay, fine. Then the tax man comes back and takes an even bigger chunk. Oh yeah, by the way, this big chunk, this is income tax. All right, okay. So yeah, I need to take that off you as well. And so the person's already got this smaller pile. And then if you imagine that you were sitting there and then the food company, supermarket came along and said, oh, I'm just going to here's your food. And actually the cost's gone up a bit this year or today. And it would be because the products you want, they're the ones that have actually gone up in price. So yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's just due to the things that you buy, really. And also because the guy next to me, he charges quite a bit of tax on some of the things that you want, for example. So that's why some of my pots got to go over to him. The energy company comes along and then takes slug of his money as well, quite a big chunk. And I'm going to charge you a bit more than somebody who's wealthy because you're on a prepayment meter. Right, okay. So if you imagine if that's also happening on the table next to you where the wealthy guy is, the difference would have been so far is that the taxman would have come in and he wouldn't have spoken to the rich person because either side of the rich person would have been an accountant and a financial advisor. Then the taxman would have went to go to talk to the rich person, and the accountant would have said, you can't talk to him directly. You have to talk to me. Right, okay. And he said, and also, I tell you how much tax he pays. You don't tell me. Okay, so the person who's on low income will be watching this thinking, right, okay, he's going to have a big pile because there's a big pile of money on the rich person's table. And he's thinking a big slug of this is going to go across to the taxman. So the taxman initially tries to do that and take a big slug of that money across. So the person on low income is probably sitting there thinking, this is great, this actually. This is justice. But then the accountant and the financial advisor suddenly turn around and say, yeah, sorry, you can't do that. He said, well, why not? He's paid pension contributions. Right, okay. Yeah, he's also invested in a VCT and he had some capital losses from before, so the taxman starts putting the money back on the table. And so the person who's gone low income is watching this go on. He starts getting to the point where the taxman went, oh, I'm actually running out a bit of cash, actually. I didn't really think this was going to happen. Well, just as well I borrowed off of, took your money, Mr. Low Income, I'm going to just have to pass some of that back over to the wealthier guy just over here. You just help me out a bit there. That would have been embarrassing, wouldn't it, if I didn't have enough money to pay back the wealthy guy. And so as somebody who's on a low income, you're seeing your distribution of wealth go across in a way that would probably be quite startling. And the other thing is, even when he saw the energy guy go up to the rich guy, he would have gone to him, oh, here's your bill. The person on low income go, why is his bill not the same as mine? He said, well, two things really. You're on a prepayment, that's your problem. And also, he's claiming tax relief because he knows he worked home one day a year. So the accountant here just told me that. So the taxman, yeah, higher, you've got to give me some money because towards his energy bill. If you're the low income person, you'd be watching this going, what is going on? And then you say, well, why can't I do that? And the energy guy would say, well, no one told you, that's why. And you'd be like, what, no one told me I could do that? No, that's it, it's just your fault, you didn't ask. You don't ask, you don't get, do you? And of course, what happens if you keep playing this out further and further when the insurance people come along and you get charged more for your insurance products because you live in a dodgy area. He lives in an all right area over there. And also I've got to give him some money back because he's paying annually. Yeah. And also, you know, the VAT part, because the taxman then comes back in and wants some VAT because you decided to buy some bits and pieces from somebody else who came through the door. When the wealthy guy goes and does it, you look at he's not paying any VAT. And you know, why is he not paying VAT? Or why is he paying a lot less than I am? And it's because the accountant says, well, hold on a second. It's nothing to do with you, but I'm his accountant. It's through the company. He's got a company, so this is legit. And then the guy who's on lower income sits there and goes, well, hold on, why has he got a big pile of money on the floor that no one's talking about either over there, this wealthy guy? And they'll be like, that's a loophole. Well, what's a loophole? Why haven't I got a loophole? Well, can I put some of my money in that loophole over there away so the taxman that can't get it? And then the financial advisor and the legal people who are probably also there will go, no, because you've got to pay me to be able to do that. And you can't pay me enough to make it worth your while. So what you start seeing is if the world really worked like that, you would constantly keep seeing people passing wealth over to the people on the richer side, but also the people that were coming through the door to try and charge the wealthier person money were getting battered away and were ending up having to pay each other money through tax reliefs, through cross subsidies or whatever it would be on products, to the point that the guy sitting in the middle who is wealthy is slowly getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier because he's playing the game. He's got people around him who are telling him where the snakes are and where the ladders are, and the dice are loaded in his favour. So that is what the game is, and you have to try and educate yourself to be able to play it a bit better. You never probably get to the point where you have an army of tax lawyers and accountants and financial advisors that the ultra wealthy have. But you can use things like pension contributions. You can mitigate tax. You can try and protect your money inside ISAs and things like that. So it's not a perfect analogy, but if the way our money was distributed was visible to us in a way that made it very painful to watch, then I think the conversation would be open up a lot more, because particularly in the insurance world, the pricing of all these products and services are very, very opaque, and they work because people want the wealthy customers, and the way they can attract and get them is by, unfortunately, on occasion, exploiting the people on lower incomes. So I hope people take a lot from this podcast about the way the world works, the game that we're all playing, the way the game is stacked against you, and unfortunately the way at the stands you've got to try and maneuver so the odds are slightly more in your favour than they were previously. And for some people that is just not possible. So for everyone who is benefiting from the game, I just urge a word of caution that you need to look back and try and change the game to make it so it isn't working in such a way. And yes, you are benefiting, but what you don't realise is, like a game of snakes and ladders, there will always be that snake, the one that gets you just at the end, that takes you right back down to the beginning. And sometimes it's just pure luck that you avoid that. And if you get that snake and you end up being on that low income threshold again, I mean, you could end up having a divorce, you could end up splitting up from your partner, you could have an accident, and you could very quickly find yourself in the game where it's stacked against you and you just can't win. So it's in your interest to try and make it easier for other people as well. So that's the message of the podcast. I hope people enjoy it. It's something slightly different, but when you spend a week in isolation, you start to think, Andy.
No, I found that really interesting, Damien, and apologies for keeping quiet on that, because it was just really interesting to sit back and listen. Like you say, you spent your isolation time well. I tell you what it highlights to me is that, when you hear people say things like, oh, you should never talk about money or talk about salaries, it's normally the people, the higher earners, that are saying these kind of things. And is it because they don't want you really peeking behind the curtain and seeing actually what's really happening? And it probably highlights as well how important it is that people like you are talking, people like Jack Monroe are highlighting these issues, people start to understand the situation, and then it may filter back to politics. And again, maybe that links into how important it is to vote and things like that, because then people can impact change and we can move on from where we are now.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic point, Andy, because I do believe you're right that there is an element of it's crude or vulgar to talk about money, but that's not true. I think if you talk about it, then inequality has an interesting way of being shown, shine a light on it, and a bit like a sort of a shadow, it will start to dissipate because there'll be likely to be change. And just like Jack, who had done this incredible thing with the inflation measure, then I think that we can see things change. It just needs people like her who go out there with a message, who can rally people, and it will actually force the agenda and start to question, why does this occur? And in the case of the inflation statistics, I don't think we should underplay how big that could be and a big impact that it could have for people going forward. So, yeah, well done to her.
Okay, so if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. And we're in all the other usual places, Instagram, TikTok, etc. So, Damien, that's it. We're done for this week, aren't we?
Yeah, we're done. So until next time.
Until next time.